Imagine standing on a ridge in the pouring rain, looking down at 39 animals that the rest of the world has already decided are not worth saving. Now imagine being the only person for miles who disagrees. What would you do? Would you walk away like everyone else already had? Or would you walk straight into the freezing water, knowing it might cost you everything you own? Stay with me today, because this is one of those stories that doesn't just entertain you. It changes the way you look at your own life, and I promise you this, the final twist in this story, the moment everything comes full circle, is the most powerful thing you will see all week. I'm not going to rush to get there. I want you to feel every step of this journey the way the people who lived it felt it. So take a breath, get comfortable, and let's begin. Have you ever made a decision everyone around you thought was foolish, and turned out years later to be the smartest thing you ever did? Hold that feeling close. You're going to need it before this story is over. 6 days of rain. The rain did not stop for 6 days. In a small farming valley, tucked between two ranges of hills that turned the color of wet slate every spring, a river that usually ran gentle and shallow had swollen into something violent. It tore at its banks. It swallowed fence posts whole. And down in the lowest pasture, where the water had nowhere left to go, 39 cows stood trapped, mud past their knees, bodies trembling, with nowhere to run and no one coming. Their owner, a rancher from 2 valleys over, had already made peace with losing them. He told the men at the feed store that those cows were as good as gone, not worth the risk, not worth the cost of a rescue that might fail anyway. He had insurance. He had other cattle. He had already moved on in his mind, even while the animals themselves were still breathing, still fighting, still waiting for someone, anyone, to come. Isn't that one of the saddest things in the world? Not that something is lost, but that it gets given up on while it's still alive. On the 3rd morning of the flood, a man named Elias Cordeiro stood at the top of that ridge with his collar turned up against the wind, watching the water rise. Elias was 31 years old, with the kind of hands that told you everything about a person before they said a single word. Rope-scarred, sun-darkened, knuckles thickened from years of fence work and stubborn machinery that never quite wanted to start. He had inherited 40 acres from his father, land that had broken better men, land that gave back only what you were willing to bleed for. He wasn't wealthy. Most months, he counted coins across the kitchen table, deciding which bill could wait one more week. But something in him, something he couldn't fully name, even to himself, refused to let those animals drown without at least trying. Why do you think some people walk away from suffering, while others walk straight into it? I want you to really think about that question, because the answer says more about who we are than almost anything else. The land that made him. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something about the man standing on that ridge, because it changes everything about what happens next. Elias Cordeiro's father had worked that same 40 acres for 38 years before passing it down, and he had done it the hard way. No shortcuts, no easy seasons, no luck that ever seemed to land on his side of the fence. He used to tell Elias, when Elias was still a boy following him through the rows with boots 2 sizes too big, that the land doesn't owe you anything. It only gives back what you're willing to bleed for first. Elias's father died on that land, in the same bedroom Elias still slept in, on a winter morning so cold the well froze solid. Elias was 19. He buried his father on a small rise overlooking the east field, the one spot on the whole property where you could watch both sunrise and sunset without turning your head, and he made a promise standing over that fresh dirt that he never once spoke aloud to another living soul. He promised he would never be the kind of man who looked away from something that needed him. That promise had cost him plenty over the years already. A girl he once loved, who left because she wanted a husband with fewer debts and softer hands, 2 seasons where he went without new boots so the cattle could eat, a reputation in town as the stubborn Cordeiro boy who couldn't let anything go. But it had also made him, without him ever fully realizing it, exactly the kind of man who would stand on a ridge in the pouring rain and refuse to walk away from 39 drowning animals that weren't his responsibility at all. Have you ever made a quiet promise to yourself, maybe during the hardest moment of your life, that ended up shaping every decision you made afterward without you even noticing. The neighbor's warning. Old Benedito, who had farmed the land beside Elias's family for almost 40 years, found him standing at the fence line that morning, staring down at the flooded pasture. 39 cows that aren't even yours, Benedito said, shaking his head slowly, the way old men do when they've already seen this story end badly once before. You're going to risk your neck, spend money you don't have, for animals a man already gave up on. Elias didn't answer right away. He watched the brown water churn over what used to be solid fence posts, watched one of the cows slip, struggle, and barely regain her footing in the mud. Nobody gave up on them, he finally said. He just stopped looking. Benedito went quiet at that, because both men understood, standing there in the rain, that he wasn't only talking about cows. Isn't that the truth about so many things in our own lives? We don't usually announce that we've given up on something. We don't make a big decision about it. We just slowly, quietly stop looking. We stop checking in. We stop noticing. And one day we realize that the thing we stopped looking at has drifted somewhere we can no longer reach it. A marriage, a dream, a friendship, a piece of ourselves. What have you stopped looking at in your own life without even realizing it? Into the current. What Elias did next, nobody in that valley had ever seen one man attempt alone. He saddled his horse, an aging, sturdy gelding named Tempo, who had carried him through droughts, storms, and every hard season his family had survived, and he gathered every length of rope he owned. Then he walked down into water that came up past his waist, cold enough to steal the breath straight out of his chest. The current pulled at his legs like it had its own intentions. Every step forward cost him twice the effort it should have. But he kept moving, cow by cow, looping rope gently around their necks, speaking low and steady words to animals too frightened and exhausted to fully understand what was happening to them. It took him 11 hours of freezing water, 11 hours of rope tearing the skin from his palms raw and bleeding, 11 hours of his horse trembling with exhaustion beneath him, refusing, somehow, to quit, because the animal seemed to understand, in whatever way horses understand such things, that quitting was not an option today. By the time the grey afternoon light began fading into evening, Elias had pulled 36 cows onto dry, solid ground. 3 remained, too weak, too far out in the current, barely able to lift their heads above the rushing water. For one long moment, standing there freezing, exhausted, his hands shaking from cold and effort both, Elias asked himself the question every one of us has asked at some point in our lives. Have I done enough? Is it time to stop? Have you ever pushed yourself further than you thought your body or your heart could go? And still wondered, in that exhausted moment, if it was enough. He went back in for the last 3. Alone. In the dark now, with nothing but a lantern swinging from his saddle and a stubbornness that ran far deeper than fear. When he finally dragged the last cow onto solid ground, near midnight, he didn't celebrate. He simply sank down into the mud beside her, soaked completely through, and rested his hand against her ribs until he felt her breathing slow into something steady, something safe. That single quiet moment, a man sitting in the mud at midnight with his hand on a dying stranger's animal, is where this story truly begins. Because saving those 39 cows was never going to be the hardest part of what Elias was about to face. Keeping them alive, and keeping them his, would be the real test. A name for hope. In the days that followed the flood, as Elias nursed the herd back toward health in his own modest pastures, he began to notice something he hadn't expected. One cow in particular, an older, brindled animal with a torn left ear and a long scar along her shoulder, clearly a survivor of hard years even before the flood, watched him differently than the others. She didn't flinch when he approached. She leaned gently into his open hand, and every single morning, without fail, she was already standing at the gate before he arrived, as if she had been waiting for him. He started calling her Esperança, hope. His younger sister, Marisol, who came to help during those exhausting first weeks, asked him once why he'd chosen that name. Because she could have died in that water, Elias told her, and instead, she's the first one at the gate every morning. If that's not hope, I don't know what is. Have you ever met someone, or something, that had every reason in the world to give up and instead became the very symbol of refusing to? What the old-timers remembered. It was Benedito, of all people, who first told Elias the rest of Esperanza's story. It turned out the old cow had a history in that valley long before the flood. Years earlier, under a different owner, she had lost 2 calves in a single brutal winter. One to sickness, one to a wolf that came down from the high country during a season when feed was scarce and fences were poorly kept. Benedito remembered seeing her afterward, standing at a gate for days, refusing to eat, the way animals sometimes grieve in a manner we don't always give them credit for. She's been waiting at gates her whole life, Benedito told Elias one evening, leaning on the fence post, watching Esperança graze peacefully in the field below them. Difference is, this time somebody's actually coming. Elias didn't say anything for a long while after that. He just watched her a little longer than usual that evening, understanding for the first time exactly why she trusted him the way she did, and why, in some strange and wordless way, he trusted her right back. Isn't it strange how the things that have been hurt the most are often the ones who recognize kindness the fastest, simply because they know exactly what its absence feels like? The offer. Word travels fast in small places, and within a week, half the valley knew what Elias had done. Some admired it, others saw opportunity. A powerful rancher named Gideon Vasques, who owned the richest grazing land along the river and had quietly bought up half the smaller farms in the valley over the years, arrived at Elias's gate in a truck that cost more than Elias's entire property. His offer on paper looked almost generous. He would take the herd off Elias's hands, pay a fair price, save him the burden of feeding 39 extra mouths on land that barely supported his own small herd. But Elias had already noticed something during those 11 hours of rope and freezing water. He had felt which animals leaned into his hands with trust instead of fear. He had watched Esperança wait at the gate every single morning, like she belonged to something now, to him, to this land, to a second chance she had never expected to get. You don't sell hope, not even when the offer is generous, not even when your pockets are nearly empty and your boots have holes letting in the cold. Elias said no. That single word, quiet, simple, unshakable, is what ignited the fiercest dispute this valley had ever witnessed. Why do you think one person's quiet no can feel like such a threat to people who already have everything they could possibly need? The pressure begins. In the weeks that followed, strange things began happening around Elias's farm, things that felt anything but coincidental. The well on his east field, steady and reliable for 30 years, suddenly produced barely half its usual flow. The feed supplier in town, who had served Elias's family for 2 generations, claimed to be out of stock every single time Elias placed an order, while other ranchers picked up full truckloads the very same afternoon. Even the small local bank, holding a modest loan against his equipment, sent an unexpected letter asking him to reconsider his repayment timeline. Nothing was ever proven, nothing pointed directly back to Gideon Vasques. But everyone in that valley understood, without needing it spelled out, exactly what was happening and exactly why. This is the part of the story where so many of us would have folded. Be honest with yourself for just a moment. If your water ran low, if your bank came knocking, if every familiar door in town quietly began closing in your face, one after another, would you have kept going? Or would you have told yourself it simply wasn't worth the fight anymore? The man on the other side. To understand why Gideon Vasques pushed so hard for 39 cows he didn't actually need, you have to understand a little about the man himself. Gideon had not been born into the wealth he now wore so comfortably. He had built it decade by being the kind of man who never let a piece of land, a contract, or an opportunity slip past him. Not once, not ever, in nearly 30 years of buying up the valley, one struggling farm at a time. To Gideon, Elias's stubborn refusal wasn't really about 39 cows at all. It was about something far more threatening to a man like him. The idea that someone with almost nothing could simply say no, and have that no actually mean something. He'd offered fair money. He'd been turned down by a man who owed the bank more than Gideon spent on dinner most weekends. In Gideon's mind, that wasn't principle. That was foolishness, and foolishness left unchecked had a way of spreading through a valley and making everyone a little harder to control. So when the well ran low and the feed supplier grew suddenly forgetful and the bank sent its quiet little letter, Gideon told himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply reminding a stubborn young farmer how the world actually worked. It's worth asking yourself, watching a man like Gideon from the outside, how many of us with enough power and enough years of getting our way might slowly convince ourselves that pressuring someone smaller than us isn't cruelty at all, just business, just the way things are done. The night in the barn. There was a night Elias never spoke about publicly for a long time. A night I think matters more than almost anything else in this story, because most people like to skip the parts where the hero almost quits. It was nearly 2 a.m. Elias sat alone on an overturned bucket in his barn, staring at 39 animals he could barely afford to feed anymore, listening to the wind rattle the loose boards above him. He thought about the well. He thought about the bank letter folded in his jacket pocket. He thought, for the first time since the flood, that maybe Gideon had been right all along, that saving those cows had only been the beginning of losing everything else he owned. His sister Marisol found him there. She didn't argue, didn't lecture him about giving up. She simply walked him out to where Esperança stood near the gate in the moonlight, ears pricked toward them, watching. "You didn't pull her out of that river," Marisol said quietly, "to drown her in debt instead." Elias stood there a long moment in silence, his breath visible in the cold night air, looking at the old cow who had waited for him at that gate every single morning since the flood. I want you to ask yourself something right now, honestly. What's the thing in your own life that you fought hard to save once? A relationship, a dream, a piece of yourself, that you are now quietly letting die a slower, quieter death instead, simply because the fight got harder than you expected. Winter. The winter that followed was the hardest the valley had seen in over a decade. Snow came early and stayed late. Feed prices climbed. Elias worked dawn until well past dark, breaking ice off the water troughs by hand, carrying hay bales through drifts that came up past his knees, watching his own breath crystallize in front of him in the pale morning light. Some mornings his hands were so cold he couldn't feel the rope between his fingers anymore. Some nights he fell asleep in the barn beside the animals rather than make the walk back to a cold, empty house. But something was happening that winter, quietly, beneath all that exhaustion. The herd was healing. Coats that had been dull and patchy from stress and near starvation began to fill out, glossy and thick. Eyes that had been hollow and frightened grew calm, and one by one the cows began doing something that surprised even Elias. They began to trust him completely. By midwinter, the entire herd would come when he called, not out of hunger, not out of habit, but because somewhere in those long, freezing months of care, something had shifted between them. He wasn't just the man who fed them anymore. He was the reason they were still alive at all, and on some quiet, instinctive level, every single one of them seemed to know it. There's a kind of trust that money simply cannot buy, no matter how much of it you have. It can only be built, slowly, patiently, through hundreds of small, exhausting, thankless hours that nobody else is there to witness or applaud. Have you ever built something like that in your own life? Can you remember the moment you first felt someone, or something, finally, truly, trust you? The night the valley showed up. There's one more thing about that winter you need to know, because it's easy, telling a story like this, to make it sound like one man did everything entirely alone. He didn't. Not quite. In late January, during the worst cold snap the valley had seen in years, Elias woke before dawn to find 3 trucks parked outside his barn, headlights cutting through the frozen mist. Benedito was there, along with 2 other neighbors Elias barely knew well enough to nod to in town. They'd brought extra hay, a spare water heater for the troughs. No one said much. No one asked for anything in return. "Heard your supplier's been giving you trouble," was all Benedito offered by way of explanation as he hauled a bale off his truck bed. Word had quietly spread through the valley about what Gideon Vasques had likely been doing behind the scenes, and not everyone in that community was willing to simply watch it happen. They came back twice more that winter, always before sunrise, always without being asked, until the worst of the cold finally broke in March. Elias never fully thanked them the way he probably should have. He didn't know how. But he never forgot it either, and it taught him something he hadn't expected to learn in the middle of his hardest season. Sometimes the very thing you're fighting to save ends up showing you exactly who was quietly standing beside you the whole time. Who has shown up for you, quietly, without being asked, during one of the hardest seasons of your own life? Did you ever properly thank them? What the calves taught the valley. By the time the snow finally melted that March, something had shifted in the valley that had nothing to do with cattle prices or grazing rights at all. Children from neighboring farms began asking their parents to drive past Elias's land on Sunday afternoons just to see the herd that had survived the flood everyone said couldn't be survived. Old women at the church social started referring to Esperança by name as though she were a minor local celebrity, which in her own quiet way she had become. Even Gideon's own ranch hands, men who worked for him out of necessity rather than loyalty, had started talking about the Cordeiro herd with a kind of admiration they were careful never to voice anywhere near their employer. Elias hadn't set out to become a symbol of anything. He'd only meant to save 39 animals from drowning in a flood. But stories have a way of growing roots far beyond what the person living them ever intended. And by that spring, the story of the cows nobody wanted had become something the whole valley quietly carried with them. A reminder, past farm to farm, that some things given up on by everyone else can still come back, can still create new life, can still matter more than anyone expected. Have you ever watched something you did quietly, without any intention of being noticed, end up meaning far more to the people around you than you ever realized at the time? Spring and new life. When spring finally broke across the valley, it brought with it something nobody, not even Elias, had fully prepared for. Several of the cows, it turned out, had been pregnant when the flood swept through. Pregnancies that, by all rights, given the trauma and starvation they'd endured, should never have survived. And yet, over the course of 3 remarkable weeks that spring, calf after calf was born healthy on Elias's land, strong, steady on their legs within hours, thriving in a way that defied almost everything anyone in that valley had expected. Word of the calves spread even faster than word of the rescue had, because these weren't just any calves. These were calves born from animals that everyone, including their original owner, had already written off as dead. Calves born from a herd that had nearly drowned, nearly starved, nearly been taken away through pressure and paperwork and a powerful man's quiet cruelty. Calves that, against every reasonable expectation, represented something the whole valley was suddenly talking about. Proof that things given up on by everyone else can still come back stronger, can still create new life, can still matter. And that, of course, was exactly the moment Gideon Vasques decided he wanted the herd more than ever. The lawyer from the city. Gideon arrived at the county grazing meeting that spring with a lawyer from the city, a thick folder of paperwork, and a claim that stunned the room into silence the moment it was read aloud. He claimed that the original rancher who had abandoned the herd in the flood still legally held partial breeding rights over any offspring born from those cows. Rights Gideon said he had quietly purchased the week before, for almost nothing, from a man who hadn't laid eyes on those animals in over a year. If the elders agreed, Elias wouldn't just lose grazing privileges, he would lose the calves themselves, the very calves whose survival had become a symbol to an entire valley of what it looks like when someone refuses to give up. The meeting hall that morning was packed beyond capacity. Farmers who hadn't spoken to one another in years sat shoulder to shoulder on hard wooden benches because every single person in that valley wanted to see how this would end. Have you ever stood in a room waiting, knowing that something you had poured your whole heart into was about to be decided entirely by other people? Elias had no lawyer beside him, no thick folder of paperwork, no truck worth more than a year of his modest income. What he had was something far simpler and far harder to argue against. The testimony. When his turn came to speak, Elias didn't talk about ownership or contracts or money. He talked about 11 hours in freezing water. He talked about rope burns that took 2 full months to heal completely. He talked about Esperança, her torn ear, her habit of standing guard near the gate whenever a storm rolled in, protecting the younger cows, and now their calves the way she must have protected her own years before in some forgotten chapter of her hard life. And then he said the words that would silence that entire hall. "Mr. Vasques can show you paperwork," Elias said, his voice steady despite everything trembling beneath it. "I can show you the herd itself. Bring them up. Let them tell you who they trust." The elders, half amused and entirely curious, agreed to let the herd decide. Before that happened, though, one more voice rose from the crowd. Benedito, pulling himself up from the wooden bench with the slow effort of a man who'd spent 40 years bending over fences, asking the elders if he might say something first. "I've lived in this valley longer than most of you," Benedito said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "I watched this boy's father work himself into the ground on land that never once made it easy for him. And I watched this boy go into that river when every grown man in this valley, myself included, stood on dry ground and told him not to bother. I don't need to see whose name's on a piece of paper to know whose herd that really is." A murmur passed through the hall. Gideon's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The elders said nothing, but something in the room had already begun to shift. What happened next is the moment I promised you at the very beginning of this story. The most powerful moment of all, and I need you to really sit with it, because it's the kind of moment that doesn't just resolve a story, it reveals a truth about all of us. Who they trust. They brought the herd up from the lower pasture, all 39 grown cows and the newborn calves trailing close beside their mothers, into the open field beside the meeting hall. Gideon Vasques stood on one side, dressed sharp, confident, used to people and animals alike, doing exactly what he told them to do. Elias stood on the other side, in the same worn boots, the same rope-scarred hands, the same quiet patience that had carried him through 11 hours of freezing water months before. The elders asked both men to call the herd. Gideon called first, loud, commanding. Not a single animal so much as lifted its head in his direction. Then Elias called, and Esperança, old, scarred, brindled Esperança, with her newest calf walking close at her side, lifted her head from the grass, walked straight past Gideon Vasques, without so much as a glance, crossed the entire open field, and pressed her head gently against Elias's chest, exactly the way she had every single morning since the flood. One by one, the rest of the herd followed her. Mothers and calves both, crossing that field together, choosing him. There wasn't a dry eye left in that crowd. Grown ranchers, men who hadn't shown emotion in public for decades, quietly wiped their faces with the backs of their work-worn hands, because every single person standing in that field understood, in that one unforgettable moment, something most of us spend entire lifetimes forgetting. You cannot fake trust. You cannot purchase loyalty, no matter how thick your folder of paperwork is. You can only earn it, one freezing, exhausting, thankless hour at a time, with absolutely no guarantee it will ever be repaid. The elders ruled in Elias's favor, unanimously, without a single dissenting voice. Gideon Vasques left the valley before the week was over, and as far as anyone there could say, he never returned. A quiet morning, months later, if you drove through that valley today, you would find the herd grazing peacefully on Elias's land, larger now, healthier, full of calves who have never known anything but safety. Esperança is older now, slower. Her torn ear has fully healed into a small, permanent reminder of everything she survived. But every single morning, without fail, she still walks to that same gate and waits. Elias still counts coins across his kitchen table some months. The land still asks more of him than it gives back, some seasons. Nothing about this story ends with sudden, easy wealth or a perfect, problem-free life. That was never really the point. His sister, Marisol, stayed on in the end. She'd planned before that flood to move to the city the following spring, chasing a job that paid better and a life that asked less of her. She told Elias almost a year later, sitting together on the same fence where Benedito once warned him against the whole foolish rescue, that watching him refuse to give up on those 39 cows had quietly changed what she wanted out of her own life. She didn't need the city. She needed something worth showing up for, the same way he had. She bought 10 acres adjoining his that following fall and started her own small herd. What changed in that valley, what truly changed, is something far harder to put a price on than land or cattle or calves born against every expectation. It's the kind of change that doesn't show up in a bank account, but shows up instead in the way an old man like Benedito nods a little differently now when he passes Elias's gate, in the way neighbors who barely spoke before that flood now help each other through hard winters without being asked, in the way a sister chose to stay instead of leave. I told you, right at the beginning of this story, that the final revelation would be the most powerful moment of all. And here it is, exactly as promised. The most powerful thing in this entire story was never the rope, or the river, or even the 11 hours of freezing courage it took to wade into that current for animals that weren't even his. The most powerful thing was a single, quiet decision made alone on a muddy ridge in the pouring rain when absolutely no one was watching. The decision to look at something the rest of the world had already given up on and decide simply that it was still worth saving. That decision is available to every single one of us, right now, today. It doesn't require a flood or a rope or 11 freezing hours. It only requires the willingness to look again at something we've quietly stopped looking at. So I want you to ask yourself something, and I really do mean this. Don't just let the questions scroll past you the way so many things do. What in your own life have you already started writing off as too far gone? A relationship that went quiet? A dream you buried somewhere years ago and stopped visiting? A part of yourself you simply stopped believing in? Maybe it's not a flood or a contract dispute or a herd of cattle in your case. Maybe it's something quieter than that. A phone call you've been avoiding for months. An apology you owe someone, or one you're still waiting to receive. A version of yourself, younger and braver, that you slowly let drift downstream while you told yourself you were simply being realistic. Elias wasn't being realistic that morning on the ridge. By every reasonable measure, walking into that freezing water for 39 animals that belonged to someone else made absolutely no sense. And yet it became the single decision that defined the rest of his life. Not because it was practical, but because it was true to something deeper in him than practicality ever reaches. Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I promise you, somewhere out there, someone else reading this today needs to hear your answer just as much as you need to write it. And if this story moved something in you, even just a little, even just for a moment, do me one favor before you go. Subscribe to this channel. Because next time, we're going back to that valley to show you exactly what it cost Elias to keep that herd alive through that brutal first winter, hour by hour, dollar by dollar. And trust me, when you see the real numbers, you're going to want to be sitting down for it. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Thank you for still believing, the way Elias did, on a rainy ridge, with nothing but rope and stubborn hope, that some things and some people are always worth saving. I'll see you in the next one.